Good afternoon. Welcome those of you who are here to eat your lunch with us. My name is Jory Burson. I'm an open source and open standards educator. I work with organizations like the W3C and Oasis Open and a number of open source communities such as the OpenJS Foundation. I'm really excited to be here today with Keesa Schreane, who is a global partner director at Refinitiv. She also hosts and executive produces Refinitiv's Sustainability Perspectives, which is a show that explores the role of responsible leadership and innovation across a lot of different industries. Keesa is a corporate trainer and a panelist on compassionate leaderships at events such as Code Her, which is a Microsoft thing, Women in Business, the Digital Summit and Fusion. She served on the Girl Scout Council of Greater New York, working on STEM programming. She's partnered with Black Girls Code and Girls Who Code, and currently serves on the Business and Resource and Investment Service Center Board, which provides resources and consultation to startups. She's also the founder of You've Been Served podcast, where she gets to interview visionaries such as Soledad O'Brien, Seth Godin, and Layla Ali, where she talks to them about how they increase revenues, improve communities, and impact lives through compassion and generosity and service in business. So very impressive. Keesa, welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. Thank you so much.
We're going to be just having a fireside chat today about a number of different issues in open source communities and volunteerism communities. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier was that, Keesa, you recently were able to host a Connecting Volunteerism to Business Goals panel last week. And there was a lot of great takeaways from that particular event that you shared on LinkedIn. And one of the points that really connected with me was this point that it's really important to strengthen employee and community relationships in business so that businesses can reach their goals. So applying that to the world of open source, like, why is that so important?
I think that's a great question. So last week, I attended the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Solve Together Corporate Citizenship Conference. And largely our goal was to talk about how we can bring employee engagement as well as volunteerism to solve some of the issues that companies are having, revenue goals, growth, things of that nature. And what we really found is that in the past, people have looked at volunteerism as something that's a nice to do, a nice to have. Not really something that's aligned with a corporate goal. Definitely not something that's been aligned with generating revenue. But now we're seeing that there are opportunities to, through volunteerism, build your brand, whether it's your personal brand or whether it's your corporate brand. And also there's an opportunity to engage clients. I know that Jory and I were talking earlier about open source in general and just the volunteer aspect, and I really don't look at it as volunteering, but that's what it is, a volunteer aspect that goes into open source. And so really understanding when we do have these volunteer efforts, how are we presenting ourselves? How are we representing our corporations? And so we really found that to be the link. Volunteerism is a great way to really, first of all, to demonstrate your own personal brand as well as your corporate brand, and really leveraging that to support your firm as well as your customers.
And I think that's very true in the open source world as well. We see a lot of developers who are really getting into open source, not just because it's an interesting problem to solve, but it's about sort of building that developer brand so they become more valuable potentially as a hiree or something of that sort. But they want to see that kind of participation from their employers as well. They want to see that connection there too.
Yeah, and on that point, building the developer brand, one of the things that I found just in my work, Jory mentioned some of the folks who I've interviewed through the shows and the podcasts, is that many times we are unaware of the effect that we have in every interaction. I know that working with open source, there are a lot of virtual interactions, so things are a bit different in that respect. But every time we interact with a colleague or with a customer or with someone else who is in our community, what sort of impact are we having? What is our intention behind that? and I don't want to sound too, woo-woo as they call it, but really going into these situations, going into these communities, understanding what we want our intention to be, understanding what the organization's intention is, and ensuring that we are aligned with that intention, I think is a really good first step. So when it comes to thinking about how we brand ourselves, really understanding, first of all, what's my intention here? What's my organization's intention? Is my intention and the organization's intention, are they aligned? If not, maybe it's time to rethink those intentions, but if so, that's a really, really good starting place to build your brand.
So I really like that you're talking about that intentionality piece, because I think a lot of people get into open source as sort of like, I do have good intentions. I intend to do good with this project, but then or they intend to improve the project in some way, shape, or form. But thinking about it that pointedly and that strategically seems to very rarely happen. It's not something that we kind of put front and center. What are some things we can do, or would you recommend that we do as developers, as executives here, to make intentionality a forefront goal?
Sure. So first of all, just simply setting it, just simply understanding, this is what I'm in this business to do. This is what I'm in this organization or this community to do. So setting that intention is first and foremost. And then the second, and maybe one of the most important, really listen. And I was explaining earlier in my career, as a marketer, I worked a lot with our developer community. One of my colleagues from the developer community is here. When I was with Thomson Reuters, now our Refinitiv developer community, I knew very little about developers. Now, I don't claim to know a lot right now, but I knew very little about developers, even less about coding. And I had a wonderful mentor at the time who said, we're talking about building out these APIs. Clearly you don't know what an API is. Clearly you don't know what it does. How about you go and learn some code? And I went and taught myself a bit of Python and then began attending meetups. And I really listened to people who were experts in the area. It was great because I came from a place where I had no basic knowledge, so I didn't have to unlearn. But the importance and the value of listening, I know all of you know that area quite well, but there may be areas that we don't know about. So the value of listening and really giving that time to the other person is critical. So I've given you two, the intention, the listening, and then finally really focusing on building together. So where there's a bridge, crossing that bridge and building together. We talk a lot on the podcast and just in general with some of the work that I do with some of our employee resource groups. We talk a lot about relationship building and where does it start. And again, when you have a direct contact with people in person, that's one model, but in many times, not just developers, no matter what industry you're in, a lot of times our interactions now are primarily virtual. And so it's really important for me to understand the language that I use. So if I'm sending an email or a Slack message or even tweeting, what type of language am I using? And if I start from that place of intention first, and then if I really listen and understand the goals of the other person and how I can meet them halfway, more than likely the language that I use will be respectful. The language that I use will help to bridge gaps, and it will help to bring us together so we'll be a little closer to our goals. So in terms of three things that are really important, and obviously there are loads of others, I would say intention first, listening second, and really focusing on building relationships. And it can be done virtually just like it can be done person to person.
I love those points because you talk about listening that helps people to remember let's seek first to understand and then be understood, and then building with people, not around them or through them or in spite of them, but with them is really, really important. We also were kind of talking about this idea of responsible business leadership in this space, which is something that I think the open source world would love to see more of. What does that look like? What does responsible business leadership look like in volunteer? communities?
Well, we're hearing a lot about, how many of us in here have heard responsible business or social impact used a lot over the last, like, say, year? Okay, yeah. We're hearing a lot about that. I know that earlier this summer, there was the Business Roundtable, which is a group of CEOs of large corporations. They meet annually. And this year, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, and others, CEO of Johnson & Johnson too, actually came out and said that the way we've been doing business in the past, that's not the way we need to do business moving forward. And the reason it was so shocking for some communities is because it directly contradicts some of the ways that we've been managing and doing business in the past. If you look at the 1970s, there was an American economist by the name of Milton Friedman, and he wrote in the New York Times and said, the purpose of business is to generate revenue for shareholders. So the purpose of being in business is to delight shareholders, and I'm paraphrasing there. But in that time, at that particular time, that was the model. And I can't say that we strayed too far from that over the past several years after that, but that was definitely the model. It was something that was spoken by a thought leader, someone who knew industry well, an American economist, and it was validated coming from that space. And so now what we're seeing is a type of validation coming from a similar space, but clearly it's a different type of content, a different validation. And so it's really important because we see people in mainstream industries, who are really talking about the purpose of compassionate business, the purpose of social impact. And what we're seeing, and I have to say too, that it's really coming together along with our conversations about sustainability. So if you look at this from a trajectory perspective, we're talking about the environment and how we can create a better environment and do right by the environment. At the same time, we're talking about people and humans, right? And how we can do better by each other. And if we look at that, how that's really emerging and converging together, it's so exciting for me because we're taking the two most important elements, the environment and people, and saying, hey, we can really do a better job with how we engage, with how we treat, with how we build relationships around these things. So in terms of social impact, a lot of that has to do with how we as corporations, as organizations, as communities, what impact do we want to have on those communities that we live in and that we do business in? And that impact can consist of reducing our carbon footprint. We've talked a lot about that. You've probably seen that in the media. It also can do a lot with volunteer efforts, right? So how can we go out into the community and teach a little about coding, for example? How can we go out in the community and teach a little about financial education for those of us who are in that industry? So it's really, I can't tell you how excited I am that these two areas are converging, because I think that a lot of us have a lot of good intentionality behind that, but we really have the space now and we have the platforms that we need to really make sure that we make progress in those areas. And another thing I know that we talked about too is, a lot of what we're discussing with the environment and with social impact is behavior, right? And one of the things Jory and I talked about is, can you legislate good behavior, right? Can you force people to do things? First of all, what is good behavior? Because you and I may not agree on what it is. And can you really somehow influence people to behave in a certain way? And the answer is, I think we've tried to do that. I think we've all seen the results of trying to legislate behavior in various ways. But really building relationships, so that intention and that listening and the relationship building, I feel that that is the best way to really understand, first of all, what does good positive behavior, what does that look like? And then to influence others toward that good positive behavior. And I know you were talking about standards earlier and the standards set by open source communities, and we talked about it in that context.
Yeah, so I was thinking about sort of that responsible business component, and one of the things that really was coming to mind is this. Certainly there's been a lot of movement within the open source world and open standards world to make sure that we have really solid professional codes of conduct that help sort of bolster communities and make those communities safe spaces to do work and to volunteer, both for community contributors and also corporate contributors and participants, right? That benefits everybody. But we also see kind of a gap in skills and abilities sometimes, because those are moderating groups and self-managing communities. But our enterprise partners, folks who are working in corporate open source, they have lots of support and policies that help people behave correctly or behave professionally in some of these contexts. So I certainly think that there's probably some lovely things that our corporate partners in open source can do for these communities, and that was just one of the ones that I'd thought of. I'm curious to if there are other things along that line that we could collaborate on across open source and corporate kind of partnerships.
Sure, absolutely. And standards are needed, right? We need to have these basic standards that everyone can agree to, and that's what makes a society, right? Basically having these types of standards that we all agree to. So that is definitely necessary. So the standards that we have in these open source communities is needed. But beyond that, in terms of how do we ensure that people are operating in a good way, people are happy to operate within the frameworks that we've designed, that's, I think, where those other elements come in, where we really can listen to folks, we really can make sure that we're building standards around an intention that we all agree to a certain extent, that we listen to people and understand which standards are working and which standards we need to tweak. So when you create these standards in the open source community, we don't create them to have them indefinitely. This is just something to lay groundwork, to create a framework. When do we need to adapt? When do we need to tweak those? And then finally, what is the purpose of the standards? Are the standards there to help build relationships? So if we're talking about how we're communicating with each other on these open source communities, how can we ensure that we are communicating in such a way that we are furthering our goals and building relationships? And I think that the standards that are in place to do that will do well.
That's right. I mean, I think we really need that sort of iterative, because that's the open source way too, right? Like we shouldn't just create a policy and say, this is it, never changing. It's got to be something that is an open dialogue between stakeholders and participants in the community to sort of constantly improve, constantly evaluate and respond to, and that kind of thing. So we're making changes for the better for everybody. Yeah. So one of the things we're talking about was in the standard space specifically, we've got, if you look at a technical standard like ECMAScript, which is the committee that I work on, 60 plus people regularly attend those standards meetings. And those are representatives from the community and also representatives from big business partners, and some of them in financial services. So, how do we create these spaces where those folks can get together and productively have conversations about the future of our technologies?
And 60 people, sometimes getting 2 people in one room and to agree on something is a bit of a challenge. So 60 people with the purpose of really building out these good, impactful standards that, first of all, it should be acknowledged that, to come together in that way is quite a behemoth of a thing to do. So with that being said, bringing this group together, this huge behemoth, and saying we want to create standards, we do have to understand that we come from different backgrounds, we have different mindsets, we have things that are important to us that may not be important to someone else. So, being respectful in that way, and I've used that earlier, but really respecting the fact that I understand that I have a perspective, but I know that your perspective is just as important to you as it is to me. And that's something that, again, it's challenging to legislate that. But if we all can just, in a group of that nature, be aware of that and say, okay, how can we ensure that all of us treat the opinions and the perspectives of each other equally, and that we can talk about those things in a way that is respectful and in a way that really gets results. So bringing that number of people together in one place, challenging, but the way I feel that we can definitely drive it forward, and this is something that I've heard lots of people say on my show, is that we can do that once we are respectful, listen to the other person, and really understand what the end goal is. And the best way to get there together is to listen and build relationship to get to the end goal.
And I think also working together on the process there as well, and respecting that process, because certainly it takes 2 to tango, and if you're not both doing the same dance, then it's easy for folks to sort of undermine that process, isn't it?
And Jerry, the framework too, I mean, you mentioned the process. If we can all agree and be excited about the framework, then we're pretty much off to a good start. But if we're starting from a place of a lack of clarity, if we're starting from a place of lack of enthusiasm, and I know people are saying probably enthusiasm at work in the open source community, okay, maybe I got the wrong session here. But enthusiasm, that's what I meant. So how can we get excited about the work that we're doing, even if we're creating standards? Even if we're carrying out rules, what can make us excited? And I think that is the something that the administrators can do, something that the managers can do to really understand what excites a group, and then bringing the group together and highlighting that particular area. One thing that I think really stands out and what could really drive enthusiasm is simple appreciation. And that's something that we can do no matter what environment we're in. But with these standard builders, we can really show how we appreciate that they are volunteering their time in many cases, and that they're giving their intelligence for the greater good of this community. So appreciation is one way to do that.
I think that's a great idea, because a lot of times this is really hard work. It's hard technical work. Sometimes it's hard emotional work to produce open source or an open standard, and sometimes organizations in highly regulated industries don't get the opportunity to do that work in the open like they might like to. So they could, as a matter of contributing and showing their desire to participate, say, here's a little, gift or a thank you or a something, and that would go, I think that would be well received. Great idea.
It doesn't have to be expensive, it doesn't have to be, here's a $1,000 Amex card for all 10,000 people. It doesn't have to be that, but merely, and studies have shown, if you simply tell your team, we really appreciate you, right? You give so much to this firm. Your contributions are recognized. If you take someone, look them in the eye and say that does a lot more sometimes than money. There are some studies, a CNBC article actually, that said that bonuses do well in terms of motivating folks, but really showing appreciation by telling them that does a phenomenal job in doing that. And one of the things too that we talked about in terms of appreciation was really how can businesses show their appreciation for open source communities. So, we're doing this work. The business may have some developers that come onto our community, this open source community. We give our intelligence, we give this information, we share, but we don't seem to really get a lot back from the communities that these businesses that we share to. So that might be a way to open up the doors and the dialogue and really bridge and build relationships between the corporations as well as those developers who give information that's really important for the corporations to do what they do.
I think another thing that's been, that I've witnessed is where a company hasn't been able to necessarily participate in the technical aspect for IP reasons and so on of a project, but they've been getting involved in other aspects of an open source project, like supporting governance or documentation or sponsoring diversity, travel and tickets and that sort of thing, so that people from the community can meet up and come together, or even just hosting them locally in an office. And those are other ideas I would like to inspire you all with.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely a way to do it. And there are tons of things that we can do, just a little research. But again, I really want to drive home the point that it does not have to be, expensive. It doesn't have to be something that's cost prohibitive. It can be something that's very simple, that's very straightforward, and is inexpensive and can scale. So if you have tons of folks that you need to show appreciation to, you can do that without that costing a lot.
So we're nearing the end of our time together. I just was curious if there were any other parting thoughts in terms of best practices or nuggets of advice you'd want to impart upon our colleagues here today.
One thing I would say is to, clearly with open source communities, you all are doing a great job volunteering, giving your time and your expertise in those communities, but really reaching out beyond the community itself and looking at organizations that you can support. Everyone in this room has such tremendous expertise and tremendous knowledge. You mentioned earlier that I've worked with Girls Who Code and Black Girls Code, and those girls can code circles around me, so my contribution is more moral support, if you will, than it is actually teaching. But you all are in a position where you have such expertise there. So, and when those girls or young men or young women, whoever you volunteer with, when they see you and when they see you show up in their communities, they remember that. right? They remember that, and they go to high school to learn more, and they go on to college and say, well, you know what, I wasn't sure what I wanted to be, but I remember when I was 12, there was this guy that came in, or there was this lady that came in, and you know, they not only taught me Python, they not only taught me JavaScript, but they were just really a cool person. They spent their time. Maybe I'll look at pursuing that because maybe I kind of want to be like them. That's really where it all starts. So I know that everyone in here has a volunteerism heart and spirit, if you will. I know that everyone in here believes in the tenets of inclusion in terms of including all types of people in the open community and what that means, but also just really reaching out to those communities that you're a part of, or even ones that you don't know much about, but you want to hear more about. I think that's a great opportunity to do so, particularly in the lives of young people.
I think it's a great point to end on, that something like 80% of the work is just showing up and being there. And on that note, I want to say thank you all for showing up to our panel. We really enjoyed having you. And thank you, Keesa.